Nobody tells you when WSL stops being enough. On paper, WSL is almost perfect. Linux inside Windows with no dual boot hassle. I believed that too, until my workflow slowly became more complicated than it needed to be. This isn't a Linux versus Windows debate. If you're just getting started with development, I would actually recommend WSL. This video is for people who have been using WSL for a while. After about a year and a half of daily use, I started running into problems that no beginner tutorial really talks about. I grouped all those problems into 4. Let's go through them one by one. This was probably the first problem that really surprised me. I have around 26.8 GB of free space on my C drive. I delete a folder in WSL which is around 2 GB. I naturally expect my C drive to gain around 2 GB of free space. It doesn't. It remains the same. Why does this happen? It's because everything inside WSL lives inside a virtual hard disk, and Windows doesn't automatically know that the space is free unless we optimize the VHD. So I open PowerShell as an administrator, first shut down WSL, find the path to VHD file named ext4 and run this optimize VHD command. I wait for around 5 minutes and then I see that the free space is really free now after Windows shrinks the VHD. I hadn't noticed this problem until Windows warned me with a notification that said my C drive was almost full. The deleted files had been freed inside WSL, but Windows hadn't reclaimed that space from the virtual disk. The second problem was RAM. My system has only 8 GB of RAM and hence every gigabyte matters. Before I even start working, Windows is already using around 3.5 GB. Then I start my usual workflow as a web developer. WSL with PostgreSQL Server, Next.js or React or Express Server, VS Code with TypeScript language server or some extensions, browser with at least 2 to 3 tabs. That's already pushing my system close to its limit. And on top of this, if I add a Docker service running or maybe a huge open source project that I want to explore, that's where things start falling apart. Then I realized something. My entire development workflow already lives inside WSL. I wasn't relying on Windows or Windows specific softwares like Adobe or Microsoft Office. So I thought, why not just remove Windows from my workflow altogether and free up all that RAM? Yeah, I can just open Windows Explorer through WSL CLI and then open the file through GUI or use WSL View to open the file through the default Windows app. But what if I want to do everything from CLI? Especially when tools like LibreOffice Writer or Playwright become part of an automation script. I can't just type soffice filename.odt and open the file, because LibreOffice simply doesn't exist inside WSL. Instead, I have to find the Windows executable, call it using its full path, and probably create an alias if I'm going to use it often. Why is this important for me? For example, I sometimes need to convert a bunch of slides or PPT files to PDF, and I'm also relying heavily on LibreOffice Writer for an upcoming report generator project where I have to automate document related tasks. You might ask, why not download Linux version of LibreOffice Writer inside WSL? Well, I did. It works, but it's too slow with some weird behavior and I'd hate to spend time in it. Also, it weakens the WSL convenience of one installation serving both Linux and Windows. As I started writing more automation, I realized I was spending more time deciding where an application should run than actually writing the scripts. The last thing I had to understand was networking. Most of the time, networking inside WSL is completely invisible. Run your development server, open localhost link in Windows browser. It works even though server is actually running inside Linux, since WSL and Windows communicate with each other pretty well. But things changed the moment I wanted to access the same website from my phone. On my setup, even though both my laptop and phone were connected to the same Wi-Fi, I still couldn't access the development server from my phone until I exposed it properly. That was the point when I realized I needed to understand how WSL networking actually works. The reason is that WSL doesn't sit directly on your network like a normal Linux installation. Instead, it runs in its own virtualized networking environment. So while Windows can usually talk to WSL automatically, devices outside your computer can't always reach services running inside WSL. While looking into it, I came across the WSL configuration option called mirror networking. At the time, I didn't really understand what it meant. I just knew I had to learn another WSL specific concept that doesn't exist on a normal Linux installation. Again, this wasn't something I dealt with every day, but it was another reminder that I wasn't running Linux directly on my machine. I was running Linux inside Windows. Before I end this video, I want to be fair to WSL. Some of these problems were specific to my workflow. Others have workarounds. And none of them exist because WSL is a bad piece of software. That's simply how WSL is designed. I could have upgraded my RAM, I could have spent more time configuring things, but eventually I realized I was spending more time working around Windows than actually using it. My entire development workflow already lived inside Linux. So instead of making Linux fit inside Windows, I simply removed Windows from my workflow. Was all that effort actually worth it? Backing up important files, fighting Windows to shrink the C drive, reinstalling everything, setting up PostgreSQL again, mounting my shared drives, and finally moving to dual boot? Absolutely. Everything just feels cleaner, simpler. There's less clutter, less friction, and fewer things competing for my attention. Surprisingly, my workflow didn't really change. I still use the same terminal, the same shell, the same Git commands, the same development tools. The only major difference is that NeoVim replaced VS Code. Everything I learned while using WSL transferred directly to native Linux. Now you might be wondering why I chose Fedora or Ubuntu, especially since Ubuntu is what I had been using inside WSL. That's a story for another video. I'm finally running Linux directly. So should you switch to dual boot? Ask yourself 3 questions. Are you spending most of your time inside WSL or Windows? Do you find yourself constantly thinking about Windows whenever you are working in Linux? Are you writing more scripts, automating more tasks, or building a workflow that revolves around the terminal? If the answer to most of those is yes, then maybe WSL has already done its job, and maybe it's time to consider dual boot.